What's up, guys? Welcome to this week's episode of Best Bets for UFC 326, Max Holloway versus Charles Oliveira, where I'll be discussing the most confident picks, the lock of the week, the underdog of the week, and some parlays that I like. Starting off with the most confident picks, we got Luke Fernandez, Dante Johnson, and Gregory Rodriguez. Starting off with Luke Fernandez, he's an undefeated rising prospect entering the UFC after a 15-second knockout victory on the Contender Series. He's a powerful striker, 5 knockouts in his 6 wins. He's patient, he's technical, he likes to set up his shots with leg kicks, he mixes in his head kicks, and he applies heavy pressure from the start. Fernandez can also wrestle if he needs to, using clinch pressure, takedowns, and he has solid takedown defense as well. Whereas his opponent, Rodolfo Bellato, hasn't been too impressive in the UFC, going 1-3 in his UFC career and often getting hurt in his fights. He's durable, he's aggressive, but he's very hittable. Usually he's just marching forward, looking for takedowns when he starts taking too many shots. I see this matchup being highly favoring Fernandez here. His cleaner striking and his better shot selection, it should allow him to land the more damaging shots early on. Bellato's best chance is to survive the early storm and turn the fight into a grind later on. But if Fernandez maintains his distance, and keeps defense and pace in mind, he should control the fight and possibly score a finish early in the first round. So moving on to our next most confident pick, Dante Johnson. Dante Johnson looks like a bad matchup for Cody Brundage. Johnson is well-rounded. He's a rising prospect with skills in striking, wrestling, ground and pound, and submissions. And he's shown strong potential early on in his career, despite having such few fights. He also brings aggression and determination, which makes his skill set even more dangerous. When you got a hungry fighter and he's got the skills to back it up, it's a dangerous combination, right? Whereas Brundage, on the other hand, he has struggled against solid competition and he tends to fade when fights get difficult. He does have a size advantage here. Johnson, despite having a size advantage for Brundage, Johnson actually holds a slight reach advantage. And that should allow him to also dictate the fight, whether it's in the striking or in the wrestling as well. Johnson, his explosiveness and his versatility, it could allow him to control the striking or the wrestling early on in the fight. And Brundage's best chance, I feel, is surviving the early pressure and hoping Johnson slows down. But if Johnson imposes his will, his pace, and his power, he should be able to overwhelm Brundage and score an early finish here as well. So moving on to our last most confident pick, we got Gregory Rodriguez. This is a high-level rematch with him and Bruno Ferreira, but Gregory Rodriguez looks like a different fighter now. Bruno, he did win the first fight, but since losing to Jared Cannonier, Gregory Rodriguez has adjusted his style. He's fighting more patient, more composed, more calculated, and he's shown growth with a knockout over Jack Hermanson and a solid decision win over Roman Kopylov. Now Rodriguez, he's fighting smarter with better shot selection, using his height and reach and improved defense to manage distance instead of staying too long in the pocket where he can get caught. The concern is his durability. If Bruno does land clean, Rodriguez can get hurt. But he seems much more aware of that weakness now and knows how to manage distance and pace himself. Bruno Ferreira is powerful and he's dangerous everywhere. So this should be a good fight. But I believe Gregory Rodriguez will come out victorious. If Gregory sticks to his patient, technical approach, improved composure, and avoids the pocket brawls, he should be able to outclass Bruno on the feet and control the fight because he has the tools to control the range and he can outclass Ferreira. So I'm leaning Rodriguez. Well, I'm picking Rodriguez to just fight smarter, more composed in the striking now. And I see him winning this fight. Moving on to lock of the week, we got Alberto Montez. Alberto Montez is fighting Ricky Turcios. Alberto Montez appears to have the technical edge in this matchup for sure. Ricky Turcios, he's known for his toughness and high pressure style, but he has struggled against higher level opponents and he holds a 2-3 record in the UFC, and both his wins are coming by close split decision victories, right? So Montez, on the other hand, he's been impressive lately with 3 straight submission wins and showing a strong performance on the Contender Series. He stayed composed against an aggressive opponent with a similar style to Turquoise, defending takedowns and eventually landing the cleaner shots in the striking. In a mostly stand-up fight, Montez should be the more polished striker here, using sharper boxing, diverse kicks, and better counters. If Turquoise does try to wrestle, Montez also has the submission threat, to make him pay for that. So overall, Montez's technique and composure, it should allow him to outclass Turquoise's brawling approach here. So moving on to underdog of the week, we're going with Rainier the Ritter, the reindeer. The reindeer has a huge size advantage here, with his 6'4" frame and long reach against Caio Borralho. Using his aggressive grappling and constant pressure to close the distance and hunt for submission, I feel that gives him a real edge here. Caio Borralho is more well-rounded, and a technical fighter with cleaner striking, good footwork, and solid takedown defense. And many people jumped off the De Ritter train after his last performance, but I'm not ready to quit on him just yet. He reportedly fought while dealing with a serious virus, which may explain the drop in his performance after the first round. But if he's healthy, he's more likely to push a much higher pace here. Borralho should have the edge in the technique, but De Ritter's aggressive style, using his kicks, clinch pressure, knees up the middle, and takedown attempts, it could make the fight much more chaotic than a technical stand-up battle. So, and if Kyle stays patient and has low volume, De Ritter's constant activity, moving forward, putting the pressure on him, might allow De Ritter to edge the fight by just controlling the tempo and the exchanges. So that concludes Underdog of the Week. Moving on to the parlay section. Starting off with the safety lock, Alberto Montez and Dante Johnson at -120 for the safety lock. Again, Alberto Montez is the cleaner, more technical striker against Ricky Turquoise. Turquoise, he fights with chaos and pressure, but Montez is composed, sharper with his counters, and he's dangerous with submissions if Turquoise does decide to shoot for takedowns. Pairing Montez up with Dante Johnson, who's simply the better fighter everywhere compared to Cody Brundage. Johnson is more explosive, more skilled in the wrestling and striking, and Brundage tends to fold when things get difficult. These are two fighters, Alberto Montez and Dante Johnson, with clear technical advantages and opponents who struggle when facing higher level competition. So I feel it's a safe safety lock. Moving on to the Iron Lock. At +120, the Iron Lock, Alberto Montez and Luke Fernandez. Montez, again, he brings the technical striking advantage and the submission threats. Pairing him up with Luke Fernandez, the undefeated rising prospect with serious power and composure. Bellato has been hurt in multiple fights and absorbs a lot of damage here. I imagine Fernandez will do the same. Fernandez will be patient, and his power should allow him to land the cleaner shots while Bellato marches forward. You're pairing a polished striker like Montez with a rising finisher in Fernandez, which creates a nice plus money parlay for the Iron Lock. Moving on to the affordable juice section, Gregory Rodriguez and Long Zhao, +155. The affordable juice, Gregory Rodriguez, he has evolved in a much more patient, calculated striker. With his reach and his improved defense, he can control the range and avoid Bruno Ferreira's power and outclass him on the feet. Pairing him up with Long Zhao, who has the explosiveness and the finishing ability to overwhelm Garbrandt, even if the fight gets chaotic. In Garbrandt, he's just not the same fighter anymore. He's 3-7 in his last 10 fights. So pairing Gregory Rodriguez with Long Zhao, both fighters, they're bringing finishing potential and physical advantages in this matchup, which makes this plus money parlay much more attractive, at +155. Moving on to the four most confident picks: Alberto Montez, Luke Fernandez, Dante Johnson, and Gregory Rodriguez at +295. It's pretty high value this week, so this is a skill-based parlay. Montez with his technical edge, Luke Fernandez with his power and his composure, Dante Johnson with the more well-rounded skill set advantage everywhere, and Gregory Rodriguez, who has improved striking and physical advantages in his matchup. All four here, they have clear stylistic paths to victory. You're essentially stacking the fighters with better overall skill sets and an upward momentum. And moving on to the fun duo parlay, Max Holloway and Michael Johnson. Two OGs of the fight game. Max Holloway is one of the most reliable volume strikers in MMA history. If the fight becomes a striking war, obviously Holloway thrives in that environment, and his ability to manage distance makes it hard for anyone to close the gap on him to shoot for takedowns. Pairing him up with Michael Johnson, who's extremely fast and dangerous early on, and when he's confident, he can outbox opponents with his speed. and accuracy, right? And he's been cooking lately. It still talks about fighting for the title. I like where his head's at, and his recent performances have looked really good. So at plus 160, the fun duo parlay, I believe it will hit. Moving on to the Underdog City parlay. Rainier de Ritter. Again, Rainier de Ritter, he's massive for the division with a huge reach advantage. His grappling and submission game can create chaos for anyone in the division. And if he forces the clinch exchanges and the grappling scrambles, he can turn this fight into his type of fight. At plus 220 odds, you're betting on his size, his aggression, and his submission danger to disrupt the more technical striker here. And I'm not ready to jump off his hype train after his last fight where he apparently was sick, right? So I'm riding with him here, and I think he gets the job done. So does conclude this week's best bets for UFC 326. Hope y'all found this helpful. Till next time.